It's an Archaeodeath publication launch.
Archaeology Professor Howard Williams here. Now, in July 2021, John G. Swagger and myself launched online on the Offers Dyke Collaboratory website the What's Dyke Wrexham Comic Heritage Trail. And we did this as a new initiative in using the comic medium to communicate the archaeology, history and heritage of Britain's third longest ancient monument, What's Dyke. On the Collaboratory website, you can explore through a 10-panel interactive map different locations in Wrexham city, suburbs and countryside, the surviving traces of What's Dyke, and understand its story. In addition to that, there's a PDF version in English, and following the translation in November 2021, we launched the Welsh language version. This is a real experiment and a new initiative, and we hope that it provides the basis for further uses of the comic medium to explore the stories of linear earthworks in the British landscape. And indeed, there's many more further locations along What's Dyke, from Maysbury in Shropshire up to Basingstoke in Flintshire, where we could also do further comic panels. So these first 10 are an experiment in a new form of heritage engagement that goes beyond on-site heritage signs and boards, the traditional styles of heritage trail, walking trails, and beyond other forms of digital heritage interpretation. On the Archaeodeath YouTube channel, there's already a digital complement to the online launch, a YouTube video where John and I explore the 10 locations and discuss our choices of how we represented the stories of What's Dyke in the Wrexham area. But because of the COVID pandemic lockdowns, it was not possible to take the comic further into schools, into communities, and to events. So I was delighted that on the 1st of October at Northop History Day 2022, I was invited to speak, and I used it to present a kind of in-person launch of the comic, sharing over 50 of the comics free to the audience and presenting on our work. Now, John couldn't make it in person, and so instead he compiled together a series of videos to show on the day, and I'm bringing those together here so that you can learn more about how he went about the artwork and how it tells a story. Each panel tells a story, but together they give you a rich sense of how What's Dyke was built and constructed, and how it was part of the complex ongoing story of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands right the way down to the present day. So I hope you enjoy these videos, and it serves as an in-person launch to the digital launch we did last year.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be at this History Day talk in person, but I hope that I can still demonstrate to you why comics are such an effective medium for doing public outreach about local heritage, and share with you some of the specific ways Howard and I have used comics to talk about What's Dyke. I haven't always made comics. In fact, for a majority of my career as an archaeological illustrator, I have produced fairly standard visualizations for research projects, museums, and publications both for academic and public audiences. But in the course of this work, I've come to realize some deficiencies in the way in which archaeology visualizes the past, particularly for the purposes of public outreach. Key among these is the separation of image and explanation, and thus a lack of embedded context for what is being shown. My use of comics over the past 15 years for archaeological public outreach projects in the UK, in South America, the United States, the Caribbean, and the islands of Micronesia in the Pacific have been an attempt to address these deficiencies. Informational comics such as these, by bringing together image and text into a coherent whole, put explanation and visualization literally on the same page. The use of captions, labels, and first-person speech within a comics panel means that these two things are inseparable. It's harder to misunderstand or misrepresent what is being shown in a comics panel because the keys to understanding are part of, not simply associated with, the presentation. Captions and labels ensure that audiences don't necessarily have to rely on prior knowledge in order to understand what is being shown. First-person speech intrinsically associates researchers and those who have responsibility for archaeological or historic sites with that work and those places. And points of view that integrate more than one perspective can evoke a more meaningful sense of context, helping audiences to better understand not just what a site or monument is, but how it has evolved and why it is meaningful in the present. In the case of Watts Dyke, as I hope you will see, this has allowed Howard and myself to create some very different representations of the monument. Reconstructing a monument like Watts Dyke, that is, presenting an illustration of what it may have looked like in the past, fulfilling its original function, was always going to be difficult. There is little archaeological evidence to go on, and that evidence is fragmented. It is the job of the archaeological illustrator, regardless of medium, to take data and interpretation and make it accessible and comprehensible. The art in such cases is all about presenting possibilities and making plausible suggestions. So here, south of Brynall and Iron Age Hillfort, where a visitor to the Dyke can look northwards along its length to where it must have crossed the river, Howard and I have suggested several ways in which the Dyke might have been part of a landscape of frontier infrastructure, architecture in the form of roads, watchtowers, beacon fires and palisades, as well as manpower in the form of military and government personnel. While the evidence for each of these elements is scant, discussion of the Dyke as a frontier zone depends on thinking about how these various elements might have originally interacted. You can see this train of thought in Howard's original sketch for this panel. How might the various elements of such a frontier landscape have looked and related to each other at the time that they were built? But although the image here is of the past, the labels help align it with the present. Pandy, the River Allen, and the Hillfort are all modern place names, and so in this panel, the frontier infrastructure of the Dyke, as alien as that might be to present-day audiences, is firmly grounded in the landscape of today. Intersecting with ordinary life turns up again in the third location and third panel, this time not far from Watts Dyke School, at the edge of Wrexham Garden Village. Relating the Dyke to everyday places and ordinary daily routines very much reinforces the message that this ancient monument forms part of the landscape of people's lives, whether they might have realized it before now or not. This panel presented us with the opportunity to show how the surviving humps and bumps of Watts Dyke have become integrated into the boundaries of people's gardens. This panel also demonstrates both the value of getting early feedback from audiences when doing such a public outreach project and how that feedback can be incorporated. Howard previewed the trail and several of the panels on Twitter and asked for comments. One respondent was prompted to inquire whether any of the trail was disabled accessible. We duly indicated those locations that were on the map which accompanied the panels, but I was also here able to demonstrate accessibility of this location quite explicitly through the inclusion of not only a pedestrian, but also cyclists and someone using a mobility scooter. One of the great strengths of comics is the ability to show as well as tell, and to communicate on several different levels at the same time. The woman in the scooter is local, doing something ordinary and everyday, but also giving readers information about site accessibility. The comic's fourth panel is visually complicated. Howard's original suggestion, that it be an aerial view of the Dyke as it passed through the area of Wrexham around the train station, seemed straightforward enough. But in practice, Watts Dyke is concealed here, in between, behind, and underneath many of the modern urban features, even those which, like the railway line or Crispin Lane, respect the ancient route of the Dyke. The visual challenge here was to make the line of the Dyke stand out from the hustle and bustle of the city, but at the same time give a sense of it being hidden within the urban environment. Here, ironically, visualizing the modern context of Watts Dyke could make it less easy, not more easy, to see the monument. In fact, however, having to search the panel to figure out where Watts Dyke is does a pretty good job in and of itself of explaining why the monument is largely ignored and overlooked in the centre of the city. For those readers using the comic as an on-the-ground guide, however, the map basis of the panel still makes it easy to discover the remains and route of the Dyke. This panel also demonstrates one of the other great virtues of comics, particularly useful when explaining heritage here on the borders: the ability to have an image incorporate text in any language. Welsh and English here, but I've also done comics in Spanish in the United States and indigenous languages such as Palauan and Aymara in the Pacific and South America. Being able to easily present comics in different local languages is an important part of being able to connect with different local audiences. There are several points in Wrexham where Watts Dyke is not only hidden by modern features, but also by historic features from other periods. Towards the southern edge of the city, the bank of Watts Dyke was incorporated into the boundary of the Victorian cemetery. In this panel, set during the burial of Susan Hicks Dennis in 1891, the grave has been dug into the bank itself, something which may well have been of no note whatsoever to those attending the ceremony. This is perhaps one of my favourite panels from the series. Like the titular mythological character in Bruegel's Fall of Icarus, the Dyke is almost completely ignored and unrecognised by the contemporary figures in the scene. We, the audience, helped by captions and labels, are able to see the Dyke when they do not. I wanted the panel to try and demonstrate how the visibility and importance of ancient monuments changes and shifts through time. While the Victorians were happy to use the line of Watts Dyke as a convenient boundary for their cemetery, they simultaneously had no hesitation in digging graves into it. By selecting a perhaps unexpected historic perspective for this panel, Howard and I hope to prompt audiences to try and understand not just how the Dyke is seen now in the present, but how it has been seen throughout history. The primary function of a frontier is control, principally the control of movement. Regardless of the frontier, that exercise of power is as much symbolic as it is practical. It is as much about stamping a particular kind of authority on a landscape as it is restricting or directing the actions of people and goods. In Howard's original sketch for this panel at Court Wood, he wanted to draw attention to the very prominent position of the Dyke at the top of the steep hill, a position which is now very difficult to appreciate from the river at the bottom, as the slope is entirely covered with trees. I chose to shift the viewpoint slightly in order to render the prominent position as commanding, and then built a scene around it which gave a sense of the early medieval frontier of Watts Dyke being as much about authority as it was about controlling movement. Much of the detail in this panel, along with the labels, echo those in the Bryn Allen panel, the first in the series, but juxtaposed with a different point of view, they create a very different impression of the early medieval frontier. In the Bryn Allen panel, the focus was on how it might have functioned. Here, the focus is on how it might have felt. Selecting 10 different points at which to discuss Watts Dyke gave myself and Howard the opportunity not just to discuss the monument thematically, but to extend those discussions across various historical periods. Where the Court Wood panel, which precedes this one, discussed this frontier zone visually as a place of control and authority in the early medieval period, so this panel at Erddig Castle focuses on the same themes, but a few centuries later. Howard's original suggestion for this panel was another early medieval view of Watts Dyke, complete with palisade and watchtowers, which would have been an echo of both the Bryn Allen and Court Wood panels. But by moving the time period forward, the panel is able to address those same themes, but in a way which adds more depth to the story of the Dyke. So here, the viewpoint is from up at the line of the Dyke rather than down at the river, looking over the landscape that it would have controlled, but from the perspective of the Norman castle, which also sits atop the ridge. In this image, the Norman defences for the Motte and Bailey Castle make use of the surviving bank of Watts Dyke, and the point of view serves to illustrate how those themes of authority and control echo through history. The varied post-early medieval and pre-modern context for Watts Dyke as it crosses Wrexham gave myself and Howard opportunities to broaden our telling of the story of the monument in ways we didn't expect when we began work on the series. I think I'm right in saying, Howard, that we didn't originally have a fixed idea of how to tell the story of the Dyke as it passed in front of Erddig Hall. And that was partly because the Dyke was almost completely demolished by the construction of the Hall's gardens in the 1780s. How do you talk about a monument when it isn't there? By showing it being removed was our solution. Howard believes that this point of view, showing the Dyke being dug away to accommodate Philip York I's plans for the Hall's elaborate western aspect, is unique in the visualization of early medieval frontiers. And yet, as you walk through the grounds of Erddig Hall, the demolition and removal of the early medieval bank and ditch are integral to the story of both the Dyke and the Hall. This panel highlights how the story of Watts Dyke comes together in this comic through a reading of all the panels taken together. Just as the Dyke itself cannot be understood, contextualized, or even seen by just visiting one isolated section, so the richness of the Dyke's story emerges not from one single panel, but from all the panels, read as a sequence. Invisible though some sections of the Dyke may be as it passes through Erddig, its story here is also the story of how archaeologists can make a hidden monument visible once more. From Sir Cyril Fox's 1930s survey of the Dyke to the 2018 CPAT excavations, archaeology done within the grounds of Erddig Park has revealed significant details of the Dyke's survival and construction. And yet, what might seem self-evident to us as archaeologists in photographs of excavation or survey still needs to be explained. The role played by the explanatory text in this panel is crucial, identifying archaeological features visible, but not necessarily easily understandable, in sections and lines of survey poles. The framing of this archaeological work by a social media post and a black and white photograph, and the consequent presence of archaeologists within those images, also provides a useful level of historical contextualization. Comics can balance information and context, social, technological, cultural, in order to build a more meaningful depiction of the work of archaeologists and the place of archaeology. There is a 98-kilometre trail that follows the whole length of Watts Dyke from Basingstoke Abbey to Llanymynech. Many people, therefore, encounter the monument as part of that walk, as a feature in a natural landscape, as something which connects them with the outdoors rather than necessarily to the past. Public outreach about archaeology and history needs to understand local and public contexts for sites and monuments beyond those defined by scholarly disciplines. If we understand that a monument such as Watts Dyke may be encountered first as part of the landscape of a walk, and only then as archaeology, we can adapt our outreach strategies accordingly. In many ways, however, the decision to wrap up this comic with an appeal to Watts Dyke as part of the long-distance walk, rather than as an archaeological monument, appropriately echoes how this project began, as an offer by Howard to myself to tour the Wrexham section of the monument with him. I'm fairly certain that experience of discovering an unfamiliar archaeological monument in the company of an expert guide helped provide a model for the way I approached writing and drawing these panels. This comic, I hoped, would be like an expert guide, helping readers to see a monument hidden in the landscape and be able to read its fragmented story. In assessing our comic, I think our decision to approach the Dyke both as a linear walk with 10 stops and as an opportunity to look at the Dyke in 10 different ways was extremely effective. It allowed us to explore the Dyke not just as an early medieval monument, but as a monument whose individual story was woven into the much bigger story of Wrexham itself. Within a very short graphic work, we have been able to talk about the Dyke archaeologically, historically, and thematically. We have been able to show how it might once have looked and functioned, but also to make sense of its wider context, despite the tangle of an urban landscape and multiple layers of overlying history. However, producing this comic during the pandemic severely limited our ability to use it for public outreach. Opportunities to partner with schools, museums, and other organizations were much constrained, and moving in and out of lockdowns resulted in publication and dissemination plans losing momentum. It meant that the booklet which we finally produced was very much the result of many compounded compromises. Having said that, the feedback I've received on the comic so far has been extremely positive, so perhaps we should consider what we have created as a pilot, as proof of concept. In that case, a relaunch of this section, possibly with a view to expanding it to include the north and south ends of the Dyke, might be in order. Howard?
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.